Hello third year and welcome to this lesson for Kinross High's Virtual School in Biology. This lesson is going to be looking at food webs, and before you start you should have had a starter activity to do, and you should also have been on and had a little revision task regarding food chains. If you haven't done those, it's a good idea to pop back and try and do that just now. So what are we focusing on just now? We are looking at how living things can impact each other. And last week we had a quick look at how we could sample biotic factors. So biotic factors, remember, are living factors which can affect the environment. And we had a little look at how we could go about sampling the number of organisms in a particular environment, whether that be by using a quadrat or by using a pitfall trap. Now, once you have sampled your area and you know what you've got in it, you can start to consider how those things interact with each other. So what we're looking at just now is the idea of a food web. You should already know that we've got food chains showing feeding relationships. And for this one, we need you to be able to identify producers and consumers in a food chain. You need to be able to understand how several food chains combine into one food web. And you need to be able to explain the impact of adding or removing a species. So a food web is essentially just a slightly more complicated set of food chains put together. If we look at this example here, we want to first of all begin with our producer, which remember is an organism that is able to photosynthesize, so it's taking its energy from the sun and creating energy that way. So in this case of our food web, that would be our green algae over here, and they are taking in light energy from the sun, converting it to chemical energy through photosynthesis, and are then able to pass on that energy to other organisms in the food chain. So if we look at this one, it's being eaten by limpets, which in turn are being eaten by octopus, which in turn are being eaten by the human. So that would be one very short food chain going on there. And remember, of course, that the arrows in a food chain are showing the direction of energy flow. Now that's just one food chain. However, limpets could also be eaten by starfish, which could be eaten by the shark, which could be eaten by the human. So we've got several different possibilities there, and when we put them all together, that's what we see as a food web. Now, when it comes to building a food web, you're often given some information and asked to look at what one thing consumes and how it interacts with its other organisms. So you can see, for example, in this table, we know that water flea eat algae, that snails eat pondweed and algae, that tadpoles eat pondweed, and that pikes eat perch, water beetles, sticklebacks, and tadpoles. Now, when it comes to putting that into a food web, what you would normally do is you would start with your producers at the bottom. So we're going to leave them down at the bottom of our food web. Just now, we've got both pondweed and we've got algae, and we know that those are producers because if we have a quick look back up at our table, we can see that they're not listed in here. They're only listed as food, so they must be our producers. So we've got our pondweed and algae, and then we're looking to see what eats the pondweed, what eats the algae. Most things do, in fact. So from that, we can then add in our next level, our primary consumers. So that algae is eaten by the water flea, it's also eaten by the caddisfly larva and the snail, whereas pondweed is eaten by the tadpole and the snail and the caddisfly larva. So that gives us those directional arrows showing us which way the energy is moving. It's moving from the pondweed, for example, to the tadpole. So moving up to our next level, we're going on to our secondary consumers. We know that the water beetle eats the water flea, that the stickleback also eats the water flea, and the water beetle also eats caddisfly larvae and tadpoles. Tadpoles are also eaten by pikes, and tadpoles are also eaten by perches. When we move up to our next level, we can see that water beetles are eaten by perch and also by pike, and the stickleback is also eaten by a pike, and the perch is also eaten by a pike. So that takes us all the way up to our final few options right at the top of our food web. So you can see from this food web that the pike itself is our top predator in this particular food web. There is nothing coming along to eat it. It's gaining all of the energy from all of the other organisms that it eats, and also gaining the energy which is passed on from the organisms below it in the food chain. So the pike is still able to benefit from some energy created by the pondweed, because that's being passed on to the tadpole, it's been passed on to the perch, which is then passed on to the pike. So even the smallest of organisms, which may not be directly involved with this one, is still important to the survival of the pike. So your task just now is just take a little minute, and this isn't one that we need you to hand in, you can just take a wee moment to see if you've understood it. So if you've got a bit of blank paper somewhere, grab it and have a wee look at how could you set up a food web if you're given these clues. We're told that grass is eaten by rabbits and voles, dandelions are eaten by snails, voles and rabbits, weasels eat voles, thrushes eat snails, and foxes eat rabbits, voles, thrushes and weasels. What might that look like as a food web? So you should pause this for a couple of minutes and work through that. Okay, if you're ready, your food web might look something like that one. We have got our grass and our dandelion at the bottom. We've then got our rabbits, voles and snails as our primary consumers. We've got weasels and thrush as our secondary consumers, and our fox at the top as our tertiary consumer. So it would look a little bit like that one. Have a quick check, make sure yours is roughly in that order. Obviously it doesn't matter if, say, you've put rabbit in the middle and vole on this side, as long as you've got them roughly in the right levels. Now the other thing we have to think about with food webs is what happens when something occurs with one of the species. It might be, for example, that this is in a garden or a field, and someone's come along and decided that dandelions are weeds and they would like to remove them from the environment. So they've gotten out the weed killer and we've sprayed all our dandelions. So without dandelions, we then have to consider the impact on other species. Obviously, a big one in that the snails, the voles and the rabbits therefore have less food. They've got less food options. So they're all going to be eating more grass, so there's an impact on those three species. However, there's obviously also going to be an impact on the grass, as it's going to be eaten more because there's nothing else for its consumers to feed off of. So it's going to have quite an impact. So we've got 4 different immediately impacted species. If this carries on for a while and these organisms no longer have enough of a food source, they may start to die out, and it's going to affect the other organisms which eat them. Let's take another example. If we look at our weasel here, if it dies out, you're going to have quite a few different impacts again. So the fox is therefore not going to have as much food. It may find that rabbits, voles and thrushes therefore get eaten more because the fox no longer has the weasel to turn to for food. It also possibly means, however, that our vole down here, its numbers might go up a little bit because it's lost a predator. So there could be a different sort of impact elsewhere. We might also see an impact therefore on dandelions. If the voles increase in number, dandelions therefore may go down because there's more voles to eat them. So changing or getting rid of one organism can have quite a significant impact. So our last one there is the fox. What would happen if we came along and gotten rid of the fox? I'll give you a second to have a wee think about the sorts of organisms that might be impacted if we lost the fox. So hopefully you've thought of the obvious ones. We would have more rabbits, we would have more weasels, we would possibly have more voles, and we would have more thrushes. However, the other impacts might be is that we would start, if we've got more rabbits, we would start to lose some grass because we've got more rabbits eating the grass. We'd also have more voles eating the grass. We might have more fewer snails because we've got more thrushes eating the snails. So getting rid of one organism doesn't just affect the organisms in its food chain, it can affect all of the organisms that are connected to it. And that's what we mean when we consider the interactions between different organisms in a food web. So from that, you should be able to identify the producers and consumers in a food chain. You should be able to see how several food chains combine into a food web, and explain what happens if you add or remove a species from a food web. And having watched this, you should now be able to go on and complete your notes that are left for you on Google Classroom.